I conducted a series of riddles in order to test your memory and intelligence.
I don't want to do that.
Are you ready?
Nope.
There's a plane flying over the jungle. It has 100 gold bars. Each gold bar is 101 pounds, which has a transfer rate of American dollars to be about $116.45. One gold bar falls out. How many gold bars do you have in the plane?
99.
Good. Next question. How do you put an elephant in the refrigerator? 3 steps.
What?
You open the refrigerator, you put the elephant in, you shut the refrigerator. Next, what are the 4 steps to putting a giraffe in the refrigerator?
Open the refrigerator, put the giraffe in the refrigerator, close the refrigerator?
No, there's 4 steps. You got to take the elephant out.
Oh, okay.
All right, so you put the elephant in the refrigerator. The king of the jungle is going to have a meeting with all the animals. All right?
Mm-hmm.
One animal doesn't show up. Who is it and why? It's a giraffe. You just put him in the refrigerator. Right?
Okay.
You're with a hunter.
Anyway, welcome everybody to the Guardian Test Prep Back to Basic podcast. We are excited to be here today to bring you another new exciting topic. It's going to be high altitude sicknesses.
Illnesses.
Yeah,
All
right. Close enough. I actually feel like students ask us to cover this a lot.
Yeah. Well, so we did the scuba diving one.
Mm-hmm.
We did the podcast about scuba diving. We talked about decompression illness. And we talked about like elevation issues under pressure, below sea level and at sea level.
Right.
And then that kind of naturally stimulates like, well, what happens if we go up high?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
I think the high ones are easier, in my opinion.
it's way easier to understand. Way easier to understand. It's so much more about oxygen or blood production than it has anything to do with like
Depth
pressures and like compression of
volumes.
gases and all that kind of stuff. Like, you don't have to worry about it so much.
Awesome.
We'll talk about that when we get into Dalton's law. One of the reasons I wanted to do this is that Natalie and I are going to Colorado in a couple weeks here.
Mm-hmm.
I think like second or third week of August, we're going to do some climbing. But our father, you and I's father, recently not recently, the last 5 years went to Colorado. Remember he flew? So we're flying. So when you and I have ever gone to Colorado, we've gone a couple hiking trips, a couple mountain biking trips.
Right.
We drove out there.
Mm-hmm.
So we've acclimated pretty easily just by driving out there. I've never flown to Colorado and like done stuff, but Dad did. And like he like landed and then they went hiking right away on like a 14er. And like he got like super sick, like had acute mountain sickness, like was just on his butt for like nearly the whole week. Like it took him days to like recover from it.
Yeah.
The last time anxiety about that.
The last time you and I were in Colorado, I think you got hypothermia.
I did. Yeah. On a mountain.
So
why did you have to bring that up? I don't know.
I just we should do it on hypothermia.
Yeah. That was freaky, man.
Yeah, it was scary. But yeah, so if you're driving to Colorado, you're flying, so something you need to think about. High altitude sicknesses.
About high altitude because you don't have that time to acclimate, right? We'll talk about how a lot of the treatment is just making sure that you acclimate. You can like there's prevention and then there's treatment for it, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I want to get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is Dalton's law. So we talked a lot about we talked a lot about like the physics principles of Boyle's law when we talked about scuba diving stuff, where like, different gas concentrations, stuff like that.
Volume and pressure.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Dalton's law has to do with concentrations of partial pressures of gas.
Okay.
So all it is saying is that like air is made up of 21% oxygen about, right?
Right.
That doesn't change at altitude. The 21% thing doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
The total number of air particles changes.
Okay.
So there is less relatively. Well, no, there's actually less, but percentage-wise, it's not less of a percentage, right?
There's less air.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So like people say like you're at 50% oxygen at whatever, like on Everest, I think they say you're basically receiving like 33% or it might be 66. I forget what side of it is, but like less oxygen, right? That's not because the oxygen concentration in air is different on Everest. It's because there's literally less air.
The air. That's why we say the air is thinner, meaning that it has less molecules of oxygen, nitrogen, these different things in it. But the percentage-wise is the same. It's still 21% of those lesser.
So if I have 100 particles, 21 of those are oxygen, right? If I have 200 particles, 42 of those are oxygen.
Right.
So if I go down to 50, half of 21, math.
Right.
I'm a paramedic. So just something to understand, right? This isn't about, it's not like diving. Diving, we had to figure out like compression of gases, same amount of gases, but the compression, there's more particles because we're compressing that and then we're breathing it in. So we have way more. And then as we come back up, those expand and release. We don't have to worry about that with this. All we have to understand is the air's thinner. So we're getting less oxygen in general, right? So
the same percentage.
Yes. Same percentage of oxygen, less oxygen overall.
Got it.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the function of hemoglobin and oxygen exchange in the body? We can move on to pathophysiology.
Because a lot of what this high altitude illness is, like Jason said earlier, it's more about blood production, how blood uses oxygen. I mean, that's the whole point, right? So hemoglobin, as you guys know, is in the red blood cells. Hemoglobin molecules carry 4 oxygen or can carry 4 oxygen, right? Oxygen binds to iron in hemoglobin. There's 4 iron molecules in a hemoglobin molecule, and oxygen binds to those different sites. So if you want to saturate all of your blood with oxygen, you would fill every hemoglobin molecule with 4 oxygen. That's kind of how that works. So obviously, it said then that those blood cells exchange that oxygen.
Is there only one hemoglobin molecule in a red blood cell?
No, there's lots.
Okay, I thought so.
There's lots of hemoglobin.
So one blood cell might have many hemoglobins.
Correct.
Each has 4 oxygen on it.
Correct. So when we talk about saturating our hemoglobin, we're talking about, are we binding all 4 sites, right? This is also why in CPR, we don't really worry as much as we used to about ventilation, because if you've got 4 oxygen, you don't use all 4 every time the blood circulates. You maybe use 1 or 2, right? So you could probably circulate the blood a couple times before you really completely run out of oxygen.
Stores.
Yeah, and hemoglobin has nothing on it anymore.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah. Cool. So that's what hemoglobin does.
Yep.
Binds to oxygen. Pretty simple concept. Your blood gets oxygen and we use it.
Correct.
Cool.
Back to basics.
If there's less oxygen, this is a very simple. I mean, for one of our podcasts, we just did rhabdomyolysis. All right.
Yeah.
So because time's weird, we literally a half hour ago sat down and did the rhabdomyolysis. If you listened last week, you probably understand how much of a crap show that was. So very complicated. This is a lot easier to explain. All right. If we have less oxygen not less oxygen in the air, but less air in general, so we're receiving less oxygen, obviously we're going to have effects on our body. So we're going to have hypoxic-like effects, not enough oxygen. Typically, there are 3 types of high-altitude illness that we worry about. There is acute mountain illness, we'll talk about. There is HAPE, which stands for high-altitude pulmonary edema. And then there is HACE, which is very misunderstood, and it's high-altitude cerebral edema.
Correct. Right.
All right?
And really quick, before we jump into what each one of those look like, but the other thing, so we talk about what the body does. So there are people who live at higher altitudes than people who live at lower altitudes. And we talk about our body acclimating. Well, there's a couple ways our body can acclimate. Our bodies can't do anything with making more air, right? Our body doesn't make more air, but it can make more hemoglobin, right?
So it can make
more red blood cells, and it can make more hemoglobin. So if it's twice as hard for me to fill my hemoglobin up, I can either get more oxygen, which I can't because I'm at altitude, or I can double the amount of red blood cells and hemoglobin I have, and now percentage-wise, I have the same as I would have before.
So I'm going to go off on a tangent here. Okay,
Cool.
This is why. So the Olympics are going on right now, and also the Tour de France is going on right now.
Oh.
So I want to touch on both.
Okay.
Because both have to do with this sort of thing.
All right.
The Tour de France, by the time you listen to this, the Tour de France will have been over. Who knows?
Sure.
But the Olympics won't, though, right?
I don't know.
We're 4 weeks or something. I don't know.
Maybe this
Time
doesn't
is weird
release
with podcasts. Time is weird with podcasts.
Maybe this releases yesterday.
Nope, that's the one thing that can't happen.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So this is why athletes will train at high altitudes. So they go to a high altitude, and people act like, oh, it's such a harder workout. Well, not really after some time, right? They go there to get their body acclimated to producing more red blood cells. Now they have basically a higher VO2 max. So then when they go and perform at low altitude, they have more blood cells than you or I would. And it's kind of cheating. You know what I mean? It's not cheating because you can, but if everybody doesn't have access to that, there is arguments sometimes where that's cheating. But that's what blood doping is too.
Right. That's what I was going to say.
With the Tour de France. So Lance Armstrong, and as well as many other athletes in the Tour de France, were caught with this huge scandal of blood doping.
Well, instead of training at altitude so that they made more blood, they were just injecting themselves with more blood.
So they were it was their own blood.
Right.
They were taking their own blood and they were injecting it back into themselves to be oversaturated with red blood cells.
So they take the blood out, their body made more to replace that, and then they put that back in.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that really cheating?
there's arguments about it. Right? So, and I think that what truly makes it cheating is that they didn't have to put in any work to do it.
Sure.
And not everyone has access to that.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Fair.
But then can't you make the same argument for high altitude training? Like, you know what I mean? Like when you send someone for high altitude training, and if everybody can't, if the the Olympian from, Zimbabwe can't do that because there's not mountains around them. I don't know nothing about Zimbabwe.
I'm sure there's plenty of mountains in Zimbabwe.
I just say, right? I'm trying to think of like a flat area. I don't know what a country is that's flat, but if not everyone has access to that, is it fair? I don't know. You know what I mean? And I don't really know what the current Olympic standings are with that, but I'm pretty sure there's quite a few Olympic facilities that are at altitude.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Like training facilities.
Yeah.
Someone will get in the comments and be like, you're totally wrong. In 1984, this was, banned. Right. I don't know, but that's the general idea, right? When you say, is it cheating with the blood doping thing? Like,
it's your own blood.
I think part of me, like the medical nerd in me is kind of like, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
There's a joke documentary that HBO came out with called Tour de Pharmacy. Mm-hmm. It's a mockumentary completely, but it invented. Have you seen it?
No.
Have I ever showed you this? No. It's got Andy Samberg in it and a couple of those goofy guys that I like. But John Cena's in it, and he plays like a roided out. Like it's really funny. But they make a joke that John Cena's character takes the blood of a cheetah because it has the highest VO2 max, and he puts it in his own blood. So he mixed cheetah blood with his own. That's like how he goes. It's like about the scandal, joking around. But yeah, it is an interesting concept, right? The idea here is more erythrocytes is how our body is going to make up for that. Mm-hmm. So, and what's interesting is we'll talk about prevention of high altitude illnesses, but if you allow your body to acclimate, even within 2 hours of gradual acclimation, your body instantly starts making more blood cells.
Yeah.
So you might have trouble when you get to high altitude, like, I feel like I'm having a little bit of trouble breathing because I'm using up that oxygen. But within 2 hours, you start to produce that. It might take some time to make it up completely.
It doesn't take weeks or months or anything. Right. Like that. Well, and that's why even most professional sports, most teams that usually, like if the home team is, or the away team is from a lower altitude, they'll come out a day or two early to do their practice sessions before the basketball game or whatever. Yeah. It is, because again, it helps.
Yeah, and with everything, extremes are extremes, right? So Everest obviously has a lot thinner air than the top of Pikes Peak in Colorado, than the top of Twin Sisters in Colorado, than on top of your hill at home, right? So, but air does thin out as you get higher. So that's why some climbers of Everest, I think, do all climbers of Everest have to have supplemental, because they put the masks on and stuff, right? I don't know. I haven't climbed Everest.
I think when you get up there, you have to have
I don't know, Sherpas and stuff did it, right? So are they just super...
Did they?
I don't know, I kind of made that up. Does a Sherpa take you to the top of the mountain and say okay, 4 more miles up there? Or do they take you all the way up?
I don't know. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know what a Sherpa is.
It's like a guide.
Yeah. I get that.
They're paid, if you want to climb Everest, you try to find a Sherpa. And I guess it's part of it's a big part of their kind of religion and lifestyle to not go up there more than once or twice.
That's what I was gonna say. Isn't
so
a Sherpa?
A big
it's not
deal.
Just some guy who moved to Colorado and not take people up Everest. A Sherpa is more of a religious,
local, culturally. I don't know. I don't want to talk.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know what a Sherpa is. If you do, email us at podcast. If you're a Sherpa, please email us at podcast@guardiantestprep.com.
Is that a real email we have now?
Yes, it is.
Oh. Mm-hmm. So we should start saying people should send in their questions to that now.
I have been.
Oh, okay. I don't know. All right. Anyway, acute mountain illness, or acute mountain sickness, HAPE and HACE.
What I like about these is that unlike diving injuries, where it's decompression sickness,
also known as the bends,
these are very self-explanatory terms. Acute mountain sickness, AMS, is you basically get sick. High altitude pulmonary edema, you get pulmonary edema. High altitude cerebral edema, you get cerebral edema. Yeah, it's very straightforward.
Cool. So let's review some of the symptomology and the pathophysiology of what's going on, right? Essentially, we have less oxygen, right? We're in a low oxygen environment to our bodies, even though it's still 21% of the environment. It's a smaller pressure because the barometric changes. So we have less oxygen. We're going to respond accordingly. So this makes sense. We're going to have kind of normal hypoxic symptoms like shortness of breath, weakness, fatigue, we're easily tired.
Hyperventilation.
Hyperventilation for compensation to try to bring more air in. You might, in severe cases, start to get altered mental status because of lack of oxygen to the brain. It might exacerbate pre-existing conditions you have. If you have angina or cardiac issues.
If you get altered mental status, wouldn't that make you start thinking about HACE though?
It wouldn't make you think about HACE because your mental status is altered.
No, not like that. That's so perfect.
So let's review some of the symptomology and the pathophysiology of what's going on. We're essentially in a low oxygen environment to us, even though there's the same percentage of oxygen in the air, there's less air total, right? So we're in a low oxygen environment. So we have hypoxic-like effects of that, right? So we're going to have maybe shortness of breath, difficulty in breathing. We might have hyperventilation. We might have general weakness. You can have dizziness, headache from this. And we'll talk a little bit more about too why the headache can happen as we get into HAPE and HACE.
And then you also could get systemic effects as well. So systemic effects like nausea, vomiting. If severe, you can get interruption in like urine output and muscle weakness and fatigue. And again, it's low oxygen. It's hypoxia. It's what the body experiences with hypoxia, right? I mean, some of them we don't know a lot about. If we're being honest, like I said, we're defining this as best as we can. But for people who are listening or watching, like keep in mind that like we don't really know the pathophysiology of altered mental status, of acute mountain sickness and like high altitude cerebral edema, high altitude. Like we think it's due to this hypoxia. So like just keep that in mind. It's not that just Jason and I don't know. It's that
I'm glad you specified that. You're like, we don't really know.
We don't really know. I mean, us as a medical scientific community.
Yes.
Right.
So and that's what kind of gets interesting. So the big thing where you run into like HAPE and HACE and you start to have like the weakness or the dizziness, the headaches, sometimes with like HACE, like the altered mental status, we think is from blood flow changes. Okay. Because of this environment where we have a lack of oxygen, you start to have tachycardia. The heart starts going faster, right? And then we have some vasoconstriction in order to try to force more blood movement to increase the relative amount of oxygen going through our system.
It's our normal compensatory mechanism of hypoxia happening. So you have symptoms that are happening because of hypoxia by itself, and then we start to get symptoms from the compensatory things that are happening, like high heart rate and vasoconstriction, higher blood pressure, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So as we have these blood flow changes, this can cause HAPE or HACE. So do you want to explain what HAPE is first?
Sure. As best as we understand, I think that, so what happens is when you have like, higher blood pressure and, due to lower oxygen levels and that sort of thing, you get vasoconstriction, and that systemic and, the high blood pressure starts to cause damage to the capillaries and leaking of the capillaries, which then that fluid shift can cause edema. If that fluid shift happens in the lungs, then it's high altitude pulmonary edema. You get pulmonary edema, shortness of breath, diminished breath sounds and things like that. And
so what is pulmonary edema? Pulmonary edema is fluid backing up into the alveoli, right? And then that interrupts oxygen exchange in the lungs, right? So now like we're propagating the problem a ton.
Yeah, exactly.
But this edema happens because of blood flow changes, i.e. hypertension. And then therefore that.
And it's an acute hypertension. So the reason people who have normal hypertension don't get pulmonary edema is because they develop that hypertension like over time. Acute hypertension. So this is like hypertension that just like suddenly happens in like a couple of hours and continues to happen systemically. That's damaging to the capillaries. It's not like they've built this ability to, does that make sense? So it's not like
someone who usually has chronic hypertension has developed that as a compensatory mechanism or through a disease process over time, and your body has time to change and adapt to that.
Right. So when we have acute hypertension, and again, the acute hypertension is not due to an increase in fluid, it's due to the systemic vasoconstriction, which like the muscles of the arteries have to work to do that, and that's hard work to do. And then again, so that causes damage.
That pulmonary pressure increases and then
and
causes damage.
Exactly.
So cool. Pulmonary pressure from the hypertension and the blood flow changes. We have increased pulmonary pressure, which damages capillaries, makes them leak, and then makes them kind of backflow back into the alveoli, causing us to have difficulty breathing in wet lungs. Right.
Yep.
And that's where we'd hear things like rowels or rails, depending on how you pronounce it, right? The bubbling. Cool. HACE is a little different. I'm just going to tell you right now, we as a medical community, not just me and Chris, we don't know why HACE happens. We just don't. But we think it's similar to what's happening with HAPE. But what's happening with high altitude cerebral edema is for some reason we're having basically increased cerebral edema or fluid in the brain. And that is increasing intracranial pressure and causing that whole symptomology.
And we're supposing that this is probably happening from similar things like vasoconstriction causing damage and leakage, but now the leakage is in the brain. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
We don't really know.
So, right, the symptomatology that we're looking out for with HACE is where this fluid on the brain, this increased intracranial pressure, is causing neurological conditions, right? So if we have altered mental status, like if we have acute mountain sickness and we also have altered mental status, well, we have a high index of suspicion for this HACE now, and that's concerning, right? If we have ataxia or decreased muscle coordination, even to the serious point of going into a coma, right? So these huge neurological deficits, when we see that combined with these more hypoxic effects, that's where we start to get very concerned about HACE.
And it's usually acute. So like one thing that like I used to think that like this was a progression. It's not really. Like acute mountain sickness, high altitude pulmonary edema, high altitude cerebral edema, it's not like you progress from one to another as you move up. Like any of them can occur at any time based on.
And that's I think what happened to our pops, right? I think that's what happened to Dad. Is like it's not like Dad was a paramedic for 35 years. Like if he was gradually going up and his head started to hurt worse and worse and worse, and he started to feel dizzy, like he's not an idiot. He would have stopped, right? Like it hit him very suddenly. All of a sudden, nausea, vomiting, feeling sick.
Well, and that's the thing. So what'll happen too is like someone who develops these symptoms will usually develop them like acutely. Like they're fine, and all of a sudden they're not. All of a sudden they're very short of breath, can't catch their breath. You know, they've developed. It's almost like you would almost think a PE happened, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, but it's because they almost get this like maybe almost like more of like a flash pulmonary edema in HAPE, or all of a sudden like they're perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden they're just completely confused and ataxic. I mean, people like have walked off Everest and stuff because of like HACE, things like that.
Oh, geez, that's spooky.
They just like ataxia, just like bye.
And that's what the Sherpa's for.
I don't.
Reels you back in.
Maybe. But again, so this isn't like a continuum of worsening and like the higher you get, and there's no specific altitude, right? Because it completely depends on how much your body has acclimated, not acclimated, and all that kind of stuff too. So for you, it might be at 5 feet of altitude, and for me, it might be at 2,000 feet.
I don't think it's going to be at 5 feet.
But you know what I mean? Like it doesn't. There's no specific thing.
Yeah.
So
that's why assessment's so important. So if you start to see general systems of acute mountain illness, not that big of a deal. Those aren't huge concerns, like life-threatening concerns. But if you start to see neurological deficits, that should always be a red flag for us, right? So that's where we're thinking, okay, neurological deficits can happen from high altitude too. It's called HACE, right? It's the cerebral edema. We might start to have that ICP triad, right? So just things to pay attention to and kind of differentiate from.
And it's not one of these things where like when you start seeing symptoms of acute mountain sickness, you're like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Let's keep climbing either, because you know that you could develop these other things. And it's not. And if someone is saying like, oh man, I'm really short of breath, maybe we start to consider that they're maybe not just fatigued from climbing the mountain. Maybe there could be other things going on. So again, having that index of suspicion, knowing these things exist is important.
And athletes, will feel like when you go to high altitude, you will feel like you're having trouble catching your breath a little bit. But there's a difference between that and I feel dizzy. Right?
And typically, so another thing that kind of differentiates these conditions from just normal acclimation is that they don't go away. So you stop to rest, and guess what? You're still short of breath. You've been sitting there for 10 minutes, and you're still short of breath. Like you're not recovering at all.
Yeah. So that brings us to our treatment, how we handle it. And the biggest, most definitive like test question answer is always going to be descent.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're up high and it's causing the issue, how do we fix the issue? We bring you back down low. Now you might not have to descend to sea level. You just need to descend off the high altitude that you're in. So just start descending and you're likely going to see a reduction or elimination of those symptoms.
Yeah.
If we need to add on to that, we can start talking about oxygen, right? Because we know that this is an oxygen deprivation issue, right? So we can give them supplemental oxygen. But we do kind of run into the issue of, does that solve the underlying problem? Again, it's not really the amount of oxygen. Well, it is, but it's not the amount of oxygen that they're getting, right? It's about how much oxygen they can carry in their blood, right? So I'm not going to blood dope them. I can't give them more blood. saturating their current hemoglobin is great, but they may still have symptoms because they just don't quite have enough hemoglobin to be able to handle that altitude. Right. So bring them down where that's more balanced out. Steroids, kind of like long-term stuff, like to handle some of those blood flow issues. Steroids are an option. And then there are 2 meds that are often used that I'll let you review because I can't pronounce meds well.
So the 2 medications you'll run into, so acetozolamide is one of them. I'm not going to get into what acetozolamide does.
It's a diuretic, right?
A diuretic,
it takes off that, it gets rid of that hypertension, that high blood pressure.
Yeah, and it gets rid of some of that fluids. Again, this is a temporizing thing. It's not really solving the problem. Like your body still has to acclimate itself. Your body still has to do this kind of thing. The other thing is that we will use, like, so if we think it's a severe blood pressure issue, we need to lower the blood pressure. We think that might help. We'll use nifedipine. Again, I don't know, because we don't know a lot about these things and what's really causing them. I hate to jump into like exactly how these medications work to reduce it because we don't really know. We've found that a diuretic like acetozolamide, we found that like, a
blood pressure med, like
nifedipine, a calcium channel blocker like nifedipine. Obviously, we're treating symptoms at this point. We're treating symptoms and not, like I said, the underlying problem is the altitude, so we'll descend them. Sometimes if it's severe, like high altitude cerebral edema, we'll put these patients in a hyperbaric chamber.
Just like we would do with diving, right?
And bring them simulate back to sea level. Which, like their depth is sea level, not, you know what I mean? That's what, so if it's an acute issue, because some of these things are self-propagating, right? So like you've got leakage, you got cerebral edema, now you've got more hypoxia. So sometimes if we needed to rapidly get their body back down to a normal level, they don't have time to acclimate. They don't have time to make more hemoglobin, more red blood cells. So we're going to put
it's funny because when you started talking, you were like, we obviously can't change the air. That's what you said, right? We can't change the air, so our body makes more blood cells because we can only change us. Like with a hyperbaric chamber, you can change the air.
That's true. Right?
So like that's what's cool about in-hospital treatment, right? They if you get to a hyperbaric chamber, they can do that. Won't always be necessary, only in extreme cases, but things that you can think about. So pre-hospitally, just descent is going to be your most important thing. Monitoring for symptoms of HAPE and HACE is going to be important because it's not just, they're dizzy and lightheaded because it's not enough oxygen. It's not just a hypoxic issue. This can turn into a pulmonary edema issue, which self-propagates, or a cerebral edema issue, which could be very serious. And then, consider oxygen. Obviously that may help. And you may be instructed by online medical direction to give a steroid or something like that in order to kind of help with the blood flow and decrease edema and inflammation, things like that. Beyond that, I just want to touch on some prevention stuff. How do you stop this from happening in the first place? How are me and Natalie going to handle going to Colorado? Like, are we all going to get HACE and die up there? No. You can prevent this by allowing your body to acclimate. It's as simple as that. So there's a few ways that we can do that. One is just time. Time gradually ascending instead of just rapidly ascending. Gradually ascending, letting your body get acclimated. Limited exertion, not a good idea in a low oxygen environment to go ham on stuff and just start going nuts, right? And really exert yourself a ton. You can sleep if you allow your body to sleep at a lower altitude or at gradual altitudes while you're sleeping. When you're not demanding a ton of oxygen of yourself, your body's going to make those erythrocytes and balance.
And that's one of the problems that happens in high altitude illnesses is that if you if you're like kind of like hyperventilating and requiring a bunch of extra oxygen and you don't descend and you sleep there, you continue to use that energy during sleep. If you descend a little bit and then sleep there, your body isn't taxed anymore. So now it can much more efficiently create more red blood cells and things.
Well, and that's what happened to our dad. Like he got there, landed, didn't sleep the night to acclimate his body, even at the bottom of the mountain, high level, and just was like, let's go hiking, and then went up. Right. So didn't allow his body to acclimate, put his body under extra stress too, right? That's not, low exertion when you're hiking a mountain. So, and this doesn't typically happen to just someone who's walking around the shops in Aspen. You know what I mean? It happens to people that are, physically exerting themselves too. Like we're going to see it more in mountain climbers and hikers and things like that.
Or power shoppers.
Sure.
Power shoppers in Aspen.
Yeah. It's a big problem.
Big risk.
Sweeping Aspen right now is power shoppers.
Big risk.
So that's, I think, gonna cover it in terms of just those 3 types. Be mindful of them, assess for them. Treatment's very simple: descent, oxygen, maybe some steroids if you're instructed to do so.
And the steroids are mainly more for like cerebral edema. So when you have edema on the brain, the steroids will kind of help reduce some of that edema. Again, a lot of the medications and things treat the symptoms, not necessarily the underlying issue. So if it's an exam or something like that, like I said, descent is always going to be your answer.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, much more simple than diving, but we cover it pretty briefly in medic school and even in medical school and things like that. So a nice quick refresher on what these things are. Again, the symptoms are pretty straightforward. Nausea, vomiting, dizziness, headache, feeling short of breath. That's acute mountain sickness, right? All of a sudden we've got acute worsening shortness of breath, not going away at rest, excuse me. Got to start thinking about high altitude pulmonary edema.
We hear fluid in the lungs, right?
Right, yeah, right. Confusion, ataxia, neurological symptoms, high altitude cerebral edema. Simple as that. Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We will see you next week. And again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or you want to give us topics that you'd like to hear more about, shoot us an email at podcast@guardiantestprep.com. If you're studying for that NREMT, or you're in medic or EMT school, or just need a refresher on some topics like we covered today, check us out the rest of our programs at guardiantestprep.com. Have a great week.
Stay sweet.
Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, we'd love for you to check out the rest of our content at guardiantestprep.com. We specialize in preparing EMT, AEMT, and paramedic students for not only their school, but also the National Registry exam at the end. Enter EMT test prep with over 15 hours of videos, workbooks, question banks, and everything you need to pass. We'd love to have you get involved. Again, guardiantestprep.com. Check us out.